Just when you think Nintendo has pulled every random surprise there is to pull this year, here comes Close to You, a 3-minute animated short from a child's point of view. There's no major evidence of any Nintendo IP tie-in, even oblique references to the Hello Mario line for toddlers. It does appear on the surface to be purely a film in its own right, and if so, represents something completely new for the company. They have, of course, produced animated shorts before, notably to showcase Pikmin, but this appears to be a step outside their usual franchise-led approach into something that is apparently completely original. So, where did Close to You come from? Who made it? Why is it coming out now? And is there anything more to say about it? Quick message up front, I'm not sure what Nintendo's take on copyright will be, but with trailers I'm happy to use their content, but since this is an actual piece of film in its own right, I'm just going to use stills, but I will link the video below for those of you who haven't seen it yet. First up then, who is going to be behind Close to You? The most likely candidate for the people making the animation is probably Nintendo's in-house cinematics company, Nintendo Pictures. This relatively new subsidiary of Nintendo is not to be confused with Nintendo's long-term motion picture strategy, as seen in the Mario films and now Zelda as well. In fact, Nintendo bought Dynamo Pictures in 2022 and adapted them into a studio to focus on CGI and motion capture projects, chiefly to develop for in-game cinematics. Nintendo have used a variety of studios to support with this over the years, but the company has had Nintendo Pictures credits for Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Bros. Wonder, Super Mario RPG, and Another Code Recollection. On the board is Yoshiaki Koizumi, who before working at Nintendo had aspirations himself as a film director and has shown his passion for storytelling many times over the years, including sometimes in conflict with Shigeru Miyamoto. As of March 2025, the company has 134 people on staff, slightly up from the 121 it employed in November 2022. If Nintendo were planning to create their own film studio, there is no sign of it in terms of the staff increases here, and while it's possible that new technologies and the use of Nintendo's existing libraries of content to speed up production might allow Nintendo to produce something quite substantial with a slightly smaller number of staff than other major animation studios, this still seems like a long shot in the medium term. Far more likely is that Nintendo Pictures will be deployed to major projects. Koizumi is no longer directly responsible for EPD8, the 3D Mario team, except insofar as he's the general manager of the whole of EPD, only under Shinya Takahashi and the creative side of the company's output, and therefore big projects like the next Mario, Animal Crossing, Splatoon, and Zelda games seem likely to receive particular attention from him. Of course, if Nintendo did want to move into animation, it would make sense as a long-term strategy given their large bank of IP and the fact that they already have worked with animation companies on a range of projects for Mario, Kirby, Animal Crossing, and Pikmin. Nintendo is generally quite comfortable with long-term relationships with external groups, but ultimately the bigger money is in becoming an independent producer in their own right. One obvious opportunity would be to put out short films in front of their major pictures, and while I don't necessarily expect to see a short prior to the Super Mario Galaxy film next year, this might be one next step the company could consider if they were building up their independent film production output. While Nintendo Pictures remain the likeliest possibility as a development group, there is another option which we'll get to a little bit later in the video, but first let's look at what we can tell from the short itself. I'll leave it for people more familiar with computer animation than I am to unpick what features here are particularly difficult to accomplish, but it certainly seems impressive to me in terms of the animation on the baby, while also seeming to be made to a specific budget. By this I mean that there is one location and an establishing shot, which seems to be a simple flat overlay over a perspective on the room. The baby is evidently the big focus of the animation effort here and is incredibly well animated, but apart from the mother, the sense of other characters are created chiefly through sound design. We never see the dog, for example. Most of the characters are still and don't require the same animation as the baby, except where they interact with the child. Don't get me wrong, I think it looks fairly miraculous, and I'm sure a lot of effort was put in, but it also strikes me as having a fairly well-defined budget. That makes sense for a 3-minute short, but if it were part of a larger film strategy, you might expect there to be a greater variety of models to work with, perhaps a garden or a hallway. In light of this, it doesn't strike me as being part of a series of disconnected shorts, or at least not a series with an imminent follow-up. I don't have a high certainty on this, mind you, as theoretically the baby character has received such great focus in terms of animation that I would think another location would be less time-consuming to model, especially if it used generic household areas which Nintendo could easily cannibalize into other projects. Another possibility, of course, is that it's part of a long-term advertisement. Think back to summer 2024 when Nintendo had people asking, who is Emio? A few weeks later, we had confirmation that this was a tease for a new Famicom Detective Club, allowing for that game to be trailed ahead of Nintendo's August financial statement. Well, we've got the November financial statement coming up in just a few weeks, so if this were part of a several-week teaser campaign, the timing would fit. Now, whether that oblique, mystery-led advertising worked for them before or not is hard to say completely, and this is a far more high-effort piece of work, but there does seem to be a similarity, and after all, Emio got a lot of attention, despite the fact that Famicom Detective Club is a pretty tiny franchise in the scheme of Nintendo's offerings. I think they deliberately wanted to avoid with this any perception that they were trailing a new Pikmin or Mario film by stripping out all of the classic Nintendo paraphernalia that you might expect to see. But then, this is also exactly what they would do if they were planning to surprise us with something new. Moreover, there are hints at something else within the video. There is a tiny movement in the background of something potentially Pikmin-sized, and of course the mystery of the moving toy is never solved by the end of the video. Now, I've been on record for a while saying that I expected a Pikmin spin-off sooner rather than later. Nintendo is pushing its secondary franchises big time this year, with Donkey Kong, Metroid and Kirby, plus of course Splatoon Raiders coming up soon. All of these have received huge spotlights, and it would only make sense for Pikmin to join the party, given the effort Nintendo have been putting into the series, in Japan especially, to promote it. And reportedly, it's already a huge focus for them over there. Time-wise, it will have been 3 years next year since Pikmin 4 released, and 18, the company who contributed significantly to Pikmin 4 after developing Pikmin 3 Deluxe 3 years prior, could likely handle a spin-off with perhaps fairly minimal involvement from the core group at EPD10. If they are working to a roughly 3-year development schedule, then Pikmin would be due in 2026. Moreover, a game where you have the Pikmin help babies, animals and adults seems so sweet as to be an obvious utilization of the series if they wanted to expand it out from the core gameplay in the same way that they seem to be doing with Splatoon Raiders and Splatoon. I think therefore a Pikmin spin-off has to remain a serious possibility. However, before we get too carried away with hype, there is a simpler explanation we should consider. We know that Nintendo do prototypes all the time for various games, and perhaps there was something specific they wanted to test here, whether to do with the character movement, the way the baby's flesh wobbles slightly, or the lighting. It's possible as well that they wanted to explore the interactivity of the various surfaces and textures. Now, this could all have been put behind closed doors, but releasing something like this would have a dual purpose. Firstly, it keeps Nintendo's characteristic tradition of surprising and delighting by offering something left field, and it's yet another way that they can say that Nintendo Today's app, in particular, is bringing surprises to people. But secondly, you can bet that the internet will scour the movie for every inch of detail, and actually that means that they can test how the responses to the short are. My guess is that what they're looking for will be different from what fans will be asking about, but if they scour the internet for, say, responses on a lighting technique, they may be able to say if what they were going for worked, and it might be a good learning exercise. This, of course, is not mutually exclusive with it also being developed to promote a game. They could have decided that this would be a perfect opportunity to run this kind of test while also promoting a forthcoming title. Now, I talked recently about online assertions that Bowser's Fury was a prototype at EPD8, which was taken over the finish line by the Redmond team Nintendo Software Technology. Having a prototype lying around gathering dust is probably an occupational hazard at Nintendo, which after all tests a lot of different ideas. Surely Project Hammer is lying around somewhere there. But if this animation were part of a project that was scrapped, it might be a good way to recoup some of the development losses, to at least utilize it as a bit of interest online, during a busy season where they want to draw attention to their content. Now, what this original project could be is difficult to say. A Nintendogs perhaps, or perhaps before they decided to go with the Hello Mario branding, they wanted their line of toddler-facing toys to be IP neutral. In this case, Nintendo Pictures may not be involved at all, as it could easily have been an external group who were subcontracted by Nintendo. Given the amount of effort that was evidently involved in this short, though, Nintendo may have decided that in this case they would rather release it and thereby ultimately liberate the company they contracted from confidentiality arrangements so that they could use it to demonstrate their own work. A win-win situation, really, but I don't really think that's what's going on. I just raise it as one potential explanation. Another potential example of where it might have come from is actually a trailer for the Directs. Notice how the building blocks are similar for the new dress for the Directs this financial year. It feels like this might have had some general vision of doing a more elaborate introduction to the Directs, and I could imagine them starting potentially with a home location before pivoting to the Switch 2. But maybe this ended up spinning off into its own small project. It's probably, though, just a case of the team reusing the same assets. So, what's next? At this point, so little is really known that it's hard to even speculate, and by the time this video is finished, more may well be known, but forecasting is what this channel does, so let's give it a punt. I would put it currently at 70%, but close to you as a tease for an actual new game of some description. After all, Nintendo does have a lot of different irons in the fire, but generally speaking, they are focused on their hardware-software lineup and pulling people in to their games offerings. I would have put this slightly lower, but on reflection, I think the mystery of the creature in the background and the MEO precedent probably bolster the likelihood that it is a way of introducing a new Pikmin title, likely a spin-off. And of course, while it's perfectly possible that it could be another franchise entirely, Nintendogs, or maybe something new, to me it only really makes sense for it to be Pikmin, given the nature of the kind of activities the little creatures involved seem to have been getting up to, moving around toys and such like. Therefore, I would say 70% this will be linked to Pikmin in some way. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a game. It could be a new app, a toy, a set of animations. Certainly, it seems part of Nintendo's broader effort to connect with very young children, something evident with Hey Mario, and perhaps also with the Yoshi game, which, even by Yoshi standards, seemed child-focused in presentation. Of course, while these are both 70%, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm confident that a direct trailer for a new Pikmin spin-off game is going to be following, but that is my central expectation at present. I should also mention that this was roughly the time of year last year where they announced Alamo, and so this does seem to be a particular time when Nintendo likes to promote forthcoming activities, even though Alamo wasn't actually properly released until January. Now, of course, Alamo was developed by their technology division, and in fact, there was an oblique reference to it in the prior annual report where they mentioned that they were working on wellness technology, a mention which was removed in the 2025 annual report, suggesting that they are not currently continuing to develop something of this specific nature. Therefore, if it is a Pikmin toy, I would imagine that it's not focused on something to do with fitness, sleep, or child well-being. I'm not going to put out particular predictions here on who is making this short, simply because there's a decent chance that we will never find out for sure, given how secretive Nintendo are. But while Nintendo Pictures remain in the lead as a likely choice, if it is part of a Pikmin game, Nintendo do collaborate with other motion capture studios from time to time, and so frankly the field is pretty wide open. At any rate, thank you as ever for watching. Do check out my prior videos on Pikmin on the screen here, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.